Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. Bonjour, namaste. Distinguished guests and lovers, fellow lovers of the written word in all its forms, of poetry, of music, and of the power of storytelling. My name is Stuart Wheeler, and I arrived in India just this past August to serve as the Deputy High Commissioner of Canada. And it's a distinguished pleasure for me to be here with you today. Canada, ke उच्चायुक्त के रूप में आज जयपुर में आपके साथ होना मेरे लिए सम्मान की बात है. This is not my first visit to Jaipur, but it is indeed my first chance to come to the Jaipur Literature Festival, and I'm thrilled to be back in the Pink City to take part in this vibrant event. This festival serves as an encouraging platform, celebrating creative minds, the power of words, and endless imagination. It's an honor for me to be here with such a dynamic gathering of literary minds from around the world. The Jaipur Literature Festival has been graced by the presence of many Canadian authors in the past, including Yann Martel, Margaret Atwood, to name a few, each leaving, as today's authors will, an indelible mark with their unique voices and perspectives. Canada is committed to values that deeply resonate with the themes often explored in literature and cultural diplomacy. Both domestically and on the world stage, our dedication to gender equality, freedom of expression, LGBTI rights, diversity and inclusion, and pluralism is unwavering. Today we continue this tradition by welcoming two remarkable Canadian authors, Shyam Selvadurai and Vanessa R. Sasson, to share their insights and narratives with us. We're extremely fortunate also to be in the hands of celebrated Indian author and poet Arundhathi Subramaniam, who will much more eloquently than I can introduce today's substantive discussion entitled Yashodhara and Women of the Sangha, where we'll be able to delve into the narratives created by Selvadurai and Sasson, shedding light on often overlooked figures in history and mythology. Shyam Selvadurai is known for his internationally acclaimed novels, delving into themes of identity, belonging, and human relationships. His latest work, Mansion of the Moon, transports us to ancient India, offering a poignant exploration of the life of Yashodhara, the wife of Siddhartha. Through Selvadurai's masterful storytelling, we're invited to witness Yashodhara's journey, her struggles, and her resilience in the face of profound adversity. I should also say on a personal note that it is a great honor for me to have the privilege to meet and introduce Mr. Selvadurai. His first best-selling novel, Funny Boy, was published at a pivotal time in my life, and I devoured his story, which had a transformative impact on me. I hazard to say that it affected my life in subtle ways that contributed to my being able to be here with him on stage today. So thank you to the universe, and thank you to the JLF for giving me this opportunity. Joining Selvadurai is Vanessa Sasson, a distinguished scholar and professor of religious studies in the liberal arts department at Marianopolis College in Montreal, and an accomplished author. Her novel, Yashodhara and the Buddha, presents a compelling reimagining of Buddha's story from the perspective of Yashodhara herself, unveiling the untold stories of Buddhist monasticism and the Sangha. With her latest book, The Gathering, a story of the first Buddhist women, Sasson continues to illuminate the lives of extraordinary women whose voices have long been silenced by history. Now allow me for a moment to introduce Arundhathi Subramaniam, whom many of you probably already know, but into whose capable hands I will shortly leave the stage. As I mentioned, she's a celebrated Indian poet and spiritual writer, known for her acclaimed works like Love Without a Story and Eating God. She's now exploring the female presence in Indian mystic poetry with her latest project, Wild Women. Today's discussion is very much in the vein of cultural and societal discussions going on in Canada these days. Whether it is the painful reckoning with our colonial past that we are choosing to undertake on our journey to reconciliation with Indigenous people, or the creation of spaces and platforms for actions to counter anti-Black racism, or conscious efforts to improve gender equity and to celebrate all forms of its expression, we are enriched and indeed strengthened as people and as a society when we seek out, discover, and learn from the unsung voices of our past and our present. So without further delay, over to you, Arundhati. Thank you, merci, dhanyavad.
Thank you. Can I be heard? Yes? So I'm not going to dwell in any detail on either of the novels at this point. I think it's clear from both these wonderful introductions that we are here really to talk about two remarkable novels. Remarkable because both of them choose to explore the subjective perspective of someone who's been relegated to the margins of our consciousness, someone who's been relegated to the periphery of the tradition, and a cameo who's just been waiting to be invited center stage. So I'm going to start by asking each of these novelists. What interested me is the fact that these books were authored within 4 years of each other. So there seems to be almost something in the air, and I'm going to ask them to reflect on whether in some way this is a zeitgeist thing, or really what their personal motivations were in writing these novels. And at some point later in the conversation, I look forward to hearing them read from the novels to give you a flavor of it. So, Vanessa, I'm going to just start by asking you why a religious scholar turns to fiction.
Thank you for that. Is this working? Can you hear me? Yeah. Thank you all for all being here. It's really nice to be here. Namaste. I heard a speaker yesterday say something about the self-mythologizing that happens when you try to answer a question like this. You try to encapsulate why you did what you did. There's a million answers to why I did what I did. One of them is I have like personal reasons and I have political reasons for why I did what I did. The personal reasons was that Yashodhara her story is so beautiful and it has been marginalized. It's not marginalized in the literature. So we have evidence of her story in texts all over the Buddhist world. From 2,000 years ago until today, people have been telling the story of Yashodhara. Where it's become marginalized is that we in the contemporary world have not given it the attention that it's had in the literature. And so it's like we're in a rediscovery right now where we're refinding things that were there that we were not paying attention to. And so one question that I think is worth thinking about is why we haven't been paying attention to her. Instead of thinking, why are we doing it? The question for me is, why weren't we doing it? Because she's there. She's in the literature, in Newari literature, in Sinhalese literature, in Dalit poetry. She's everywhere, in early Pali texts as well, and yet we didn't give her any attention. And it's a beautiful story. It's sad, it's dramatic, it's fabulous, it's tragic. It's the story of suffering and it's the story of inspiration. It's like made for an opera, her story, right? And so it deserves to be told again. It deserves more attention. And so the fact that the two of us wrote about it, I think more and more people need to write about it. I think we're starting to realize, oh, this is a story that needs to be told again and again and again. We should never be done with it. So I told it because I'm in love with the story and I wanted to enjoy it. I told it as a story instead of writing it as an academic book. In part just because personally I was like, oh my God, I can't write any more academic books. There's like a thing about that. But so I was looking for change in my own writing style and all those kind of midlife crisis things that happen. But I also told it because I realized it's important as scholars that we don't live in a bubble. And so I think sometimes we do, and we talk to each other. And there's merit to that on some levels. I don't want to dismiss it, but there's also the reality that I have a extraordinary privilege to have a lot of education. And not everyone gets to have that and to dedicate their lives to studying the way some of us do. And I do think that there's actually, I felt like a responsibility and a requirement to find ways to articulate what I've learned in ways that are more accessible than just the academic discourse. It's not always accessible to everyone. It's valuable, but it's not always accessible. And so I was trying to figure out how can I share this magnificent material that tortures me, that I'm not done with, in a wider way so that other people can enjoy it and not just be left in these texts that nobody else is reading. So I had a bunch of answers to that question, but I wanted to do it. That was clear.
Yes. And I think as we were just discussing before this, it seems like in the Therigatha, almost every one of those characters deserves multiple retellings of their
Yes.
story, isn't it? There's room for all of that and more.
That's the thing. So if you read both of our books, they're different. And if you write a book, it'll be different again, because these stories are really alive and they've been changing for 2,000 years. So there's this, I think sometimes we get, certainly in religious discourse, there's this imagination that there's one way of doing things. But religious literature is vast and it's complicated and it's never finished. And so there's got to be multiple tellings, and we have to do more of them, because these stories really deserve that kind of engagement. And so I hope there's more books on Yashodhara and on all the women of the Therigatha. But I'm going to pass it to you.
Sham, I know you touch on this in some degree, to some degree in your introduction. I wonder if you'd like to say more. How this began for you.
Well, so in the early 2000s, I had a rather ugly incident with some security personnel in Sri Lanka, and that released in me all the trauma of the civil war I had gone through and my family had gone through. And so I decided to do the sensible thing and see a counselor about it. And she taught me a lot of great stuff. But then at some point I hit a inexplicable wall and I couldn't figure out what this was. And then I read Karen Armstrong's Buddha, and it was a real eye-opener, because Sri Lanka is a Buddhist country, and yet the Buddhism or the story of Siddhartha that she talked about was not the religion of Sri Lanka, nor was it the kind of touchy-feely, navel-gazing Buddhism of the New Age movement in the West, but rather it's the story of this man who looked at the fundamental truth of human life, which is change, and how everything, including ourselves, changes, and most poignantly our bodies. And he asked the question, well, how can you be happy when this is a fundamental fact of life, and also loss? And so I realized at that point that the problem with Western psychology was that it focuses on the self, and it insists that you hold on to this self. And this traumatized self of mine was now beginning to change and wanting to become something else, and move beyond this identity of being this traumatized person. And Buddhism allowed me to move beyond it by this acceptance that the self itself is changing and changing and changing. And so, of course, being an author or a novelist, then I'm opportunistic. So I thought, how can I now include this in my actual fiction? And I began to write this book, my previous book, The Hungry Ghosts, which incorporates Buddhist themes into, themes of sexuality and race and immigration. And all the time I was writing this, I was thinking about Siddhartha and his journey, and I was wondering if I could write it, and whether I dared write it. And then around that time, I was the curator of the Gaul Literary Festival in Sri Lanka, and I invited this scholar, Ranjini Obesekara, to talk about a wonderful collection of Buddhist stories of Buddhist women that she'd written. And Ranjini said she would love to come, but could she speak about the Buddha's wife? And I said, what? I said, I know he had a wife, but I know nothing about her. And then Ranjini sent me her translation of these Sinhalese poems called the Yashodhara. And I was immediately riveted by this story of this woman whose life reflects all the themes of Buddhism. Her life changes and changes and changes, and she has to deal constantly with things that are outside of her control. And one of the central one of the central themes of Yashodhara's story is this idea of abandonment by people who we love. And this is a central theme to all our lives. And in fact, the Yashodhara is sung at funerals, because death is the final abandonment of our loved ones. So I thought, my God, I found it. I found the story I want to tell. But of course, everybody asks you what gets you started, but what keeps you writing is, I think, the more important question. And what keeps me writing is always some kind of mysterious half question that I can't answer for myself, and I'm hoping the book will bring me to an answer. And there were two of them. The first is, living in the West, I see that South Asian women are strong in a different way from Western feminists. And I did not know how to articulate that theoretically, but I knew it as a lived experience, these women in my life, and I wanted to capture it somehow through Yashodhara. Could I take that thing that I saw in my life of this particular strength, our South Asian women's way of being strong in the world, and put it in the book in a way that was not Western feminism. So that became an obsession with me, and I don't know if I've succeeded or not, but that was the other thing. And the second thing is I don't know why, but I believe that pleasure is political. And I was trying to write, I've written about the Civil War. I'm so tired of writing about the Civil War. I wanted to write a book that was just pure pleasure to write, and that I hoped would be pure pleasure to read. And I wanted to try and capture that propulsive, immersive experience that all of us have experienced in 19th century literature. So in that sense, it's a bit of an old-fashioned book in that sense, that it tries to do that. So I mean, those are the things that kept me writing. Yeah, I don't know whether I've succeeded with them or not, but it's just, it's a thing.
Actually, what struck me about what both of you are saying at this point is how there seems to be, and this is what I mean about something almost being in the air. My book, Wild Women, is really about filling in those silences that have somehow crept in, where the voices have always been there, we've just not tuned in. And the sense of voices of great power and rapture and self-discovery that have also existed, to which we have not tuned in for some reason. So I think they've been waiting to be retrieved. What struck me about both these novels is that there are similarities. In both, Yashodhara is a proud, spirited woman with questions that will perhaps remain unanswered, some of them. In both cases, there is a very deep and very genuine love between her and Siddhartha. In both, there is a deep preoccupation with women's relationships and female bonding. And yet, they are vastly dissimilar. And they're most dissimilar in terms of their treatment of this theme, because Vanessa chooses what she calls hagiographical fiction, which is vast dollops of the magical and the miraculous, which I'm going to ask her to talk about before we come to Shyam. Tell us about that approach and whether that was evident to you from the start.
So the more you spend time looking at ancient Indian literature, it's just impossible not to see the fabulous. I mean, it's just every biography of the Buddha, every time Yashodhara shows up, all the Buddhist literature that I've spent my life reading, or my academic life reading, is filled with beauty and magic and flowers that fall from the sky and gods that intervene. And things are just constantly happening. I think, so again, it's what we've done in the contemporary context that has me wondering, why did we make certain decisions? And I have lots of answers that could be for an academic discussion later, but one of the odd things that we've done in the West and in academic discourse generally is that we've stripped the Buddhist narrative of all of this exquisite beauty, and we've turned it into a guy who was struggling and went to the forest and figured it out. So it's, so I didn't mean that as a funny thing, but that is what we did, right? So I feel like we've kind of killed Buddhism of the fabulous. We got rid of it. And I think there's reasons for why we've done that, but I do think we've done it. And I think if you look at the text again, if you look at the literature again, you will find every page is literally dripping with the magical and the beautiful. And think of the Mahabharata and the Ramayana. These are not, kings who went to the forest and figured it out. They're fabulous stories of gods and magic and intervention, and they're wonderful. And we've eliminated a lot of that. And so that's what seems so obvious to me. And I thought, where did we put it? And why did we get rid of it? What did we want from the tradition that we didn't let ourselves see it? So I couldn't tell. So the earlier version of the book that I wrote was a little wilder, and there was people talking in the sky all the time, and it got a little crazy. And a lot of the people who were giving me advice on the book were like, what's happening in your book? So I had to tone it down. So it's a lot more toned down than what I originally wanted to do. So it's much more reasonable as an account, but had I really let myself go, it would have been a lot more. But I try to inject some of that magic that I think is in the literature and the jewels and the, right? But none of that is historically possible. Like, I mean, so the world that I'm describing is not historical fiction. I don't even know how much of this story, if any of it, is historical. So I'm not trying to write historical fiction. I'm engaging with the hagiographies. I'm engaging with the religious literature of the tradition and participating in it. And so I tried to create a world that was dripping with jewels and where gods kind of bump into you in the sky. And to me, that spoke of the flavor of this literature as best as I could produce it. And I think that's wonderful, and I don't know why we would want to get rid of it. I think there's an aesthetic to this literature that's worth loving. I do anyway. So
What I particularly liked, Vanessa, is that you do it, but not in a self-conscious way. There is a matter-of-factness almost with which those gods look in, and people see the deities up there, and you know, it's just that the veils are thinner, and there's a fair amount of interaction that seems possible.
Well, that's how it is in the literature. And then in terms of the relationships between the Buddha and his wife, this is also part of the magic of the story. So one of the things that really inspired me to write the book is there's this literature called the Jatakas in Buddhist literature. So a lot of you are going, yes, I know. Okay, so so the Jatakas, for the few of you who don't know, are these past life stories of the Buddha. And they're all over the tradition. We have them in every language. We have them everywhere. And they're great stories, also fabulous. And it's like the Buddha was a monkey in a past life, and then he's a crocodile, and then he's a whatever. And sometimes he's a bad guy, which is really interesting. He's never a woman, because that's a stretch of the imagination. But, I mean, like in some traditions, they finally added it, but the early Pali tradition, it just doesn't happen. But at the end of every Jataka, so you get the story of like the Buddha in a past life was X, Y, or Z, this happened, and then here's your lesson, right? And then at the end of the story, the Buddha comes back to the present, and he has this little formula at the end where he identifies all the characters. So, you know, this crocodile was this character, and that crocodile was that character, so that it comes back to his present life. In every Jataka where he has a wife, his wife is Yashodhara. So he says, oh, this was my mother, and this way, and Mrs. Crocodile was Yashodhara. I mean, it's Rahula Mata, but anyway, that's a technicality. It doesn't matter. And so that detail really fascinated me, and I thought, oh my goodness, this is not just a tragic love story of one lifetime. This is way bigger than Romeo and Juliet. This is bigger than anything the West has ever produced, because this is a multi-life tragedy. He was with her for lifetime after lifetime after lifetime, and then he leaves her. And so the sense of, right, so it's terrible, but it's also beautiful. I mean, to sense this connection that they were together lifetime after lifetime after lifetime, that they keep finding each other, and they keep returning to each other. And then at the last life, he says, I can't have you come with me. This part I have to do alone. He has to let her go. And to me, that spoke of such a relationship that I picture anguish, right? For him and for her, right? That he has to let her go if he's going to finish this journey. What a tragedy. And so that magic of the multi-life story is embedded, right? Is that they've been together forever. And then he lets her go. It's beautiful. It's an opera.
Whereas Shyam, your approach is very stylistically very different.
Yes.
Much more realist.
Yes.
And was that also evident to you from the start, that that's how you were going to approach this?
Yeah, I mean, I wanted to write it in this immersive way just through her point of view. And I wanted her to feel everything as it was happening and her bewilderment. I mean, she doesn't know about these past lives or anything. She's just, this woman who married this man she really loved, and they had this wonderful marriage as friends and mates and lovers. And then he begins to change, and this change, and it happens in marriages, I mean, it really does. This change begins to occur in the marriage, and sometimes the change is so great that the marriage can't hold the change, and so the marriage has to crumble. So in a way, it's a portrait of a marriage. And so I was really interested in staying very much with her and her bewilderment, and also I didn't want to have any of that in it. I wanted it to be a very realistic story about her, because that's the Siddhartha, that's the Buddhism that really changed me. So, and I wanted to capture that in the book. And I also wondered that when he came back as the Buddha, there is something mystical about him that she can't penetrate. There's something changed about him. In fact, she passes him on the street. She's gone to look for him, and she passes him on the street, and she doesn't realize it's him because she's checking all the monks to see which one is him. And then she sees Ananda lead his father to him, and then she's standing in a doorway hidden, and she's looking at him, and she goes, it's the same features, but he's profoundly changed as a person. And so that aspect of it, I wanted that, because really when you see these enlightened, or these monks who are highly enlightened, there's something about them that is different from us. And I wanted her to experience it as we would experience it, as unenlightened beings looking at this. So that's where the magic of it lies. And also, the Buddha himself is very much against people, against the monks displaying their magic, and because he felt it was a distraction from the path. And so I wanted that to be also part of his humility and all that, because Ananda says to her that he knows, because he serves the Buddha, that the Buddha has this, he has got this extrasensory ability to predict the future, and he'll say to him, now tomorrow this man is coming and he's going to sit here, make sure he stays after I want to talk to him. But he doesn't want anybody to know this, because again, he wants focus on the path. So in that sense, that was the Buddhism I was interested in. I was interested in what he wanted, which is to stay focused on the path.
In fact, what's interesting about both these novels is that neither of them denounces one character to validate the other. And that is the complexity that they bring to their fiction. I know we are running short of time, but we did start late. So this is a plea. I'm looking in the direction of the JLF people, but I'm going to invite them to read. But I just want to say, before I invite each of them to read, the important thing about this book is that Yashodhara's journey of self-discovery in both their books happens through her own life experiences. It doesn't happen the way it does for Siddhartha, but she has her own spiritual journey. She has her spiritual journey through rites of passage in Vanessa's book, menstruation, childbirth. All of that is part of her journey. Grief, loss, abandonment, all of that makes Yashodhara who she is. And in Shyam's book, there is the entire psychological landscape of grief, rage, abandonment, as well as, and this I found particularly interesting, the way in which Yashodhara is actively engaged with the physical aspects of life. Yes. Gardening, sewing, making quilts. In that actual physical engagement with reality, something shifts within her. There's a lovely line in which you say about her mother's death, you say, she refuses to see her mother's death as an illusion. She must feel it. So there is a certain way in which the body comes center stage as well, in different ways in both their novels. And on that note, can I invite you to read?
Shall I start?
Maybe Shyam, yeah.
Yes, in fact, in her mother's death, Siddhartha says, you should just imagine your mother as a grain of salt who's dissolved in the great universe. And she says, I don't want to do that. My mother is real. I want to take her into me in a way. And she begins to adopt some of her mother's habits. Okay, the book also has a lot of, I hope, pleasure in it. It's not all about pain. And I wanted to read the part. So we know that in the Buddha's time that the courtesans were great figures of glamour, like film stars are in our time. And we know that respectable women used to go to see them during the daytime. And we don't know what they went for. They might have gone for classes in the feminine arts. But one scholar kind of theorized that they could be going to discuss problems in the marriage bed, or marriage problems. And from that, I invented this idea that a week after a marriage, a young woman gets to go to see a courtesan to discuss if there's any problems in the marriage bed. And so Yashodhara is very excited about this visit to enter this glamorous world. And I'm just going to read the part where she actually meets the Ganika. And the Ganika is a word I'm using for courtesan. And Dahare means my dear child. She nodded and followed the servant up the dark staircase, enclosed in wood to maintain the privacy of the visitor and also to keep hidden the women's living quarters on the second floor. When she arrived at the receiving room on the third floor, she took a moment to let her eyes adjust to the dimness. And then there she was, the courtesan Vimala, seated cross-legged on a charpoy in a ray of sunshine coming through the window. Lovely, with her enchanting heart-shaped face and rounded hips, breasts straining against her bodice cloth, which she wore secured around her neck in an elaborate knot. She beckoned Yashodhara forward with a dimpled smile and said sweetly, "Come, Dahare, join me," patting the charpoy and arranging some cushions for her guest. As Yashodhara climbed up onto the charpoy and settled herself, she found herself smiling back shyly under the Ganika's merry gaze, taking in her plump, naked arms the press of her voluptuous thighs against the crisp folds of her dhoti, the scent of jasmine from her hair. When Yashodhara was settled, Vimala took her guest by the chin and examined her. So lovely. The entire city speaks of your bridal procession. She turned Yashodhara's face this way and that. Ambapali would be envious. Yashodhara blushed at this highest compliment a woman could be paid, to be compared to the great courtesan of Vesali, the most beautiful woman in the middle country. And have you ever met the great Ambapali, she asked, to deflect the further compliments. Vimala nodded and mock grimaced. No woman, especially someone like me, whose beauty is her career, should meet the great Ambapali. I am nothing but a crow compared to her. So, then the stories are true, Yashodhara asked breathless, for she had always longed to see this legendary beauty. Vimala laughed and nodded. They say she's not human, but the daughter of an Apsara, and when you see her, you can believe that is true. Her beauty is unearthly. She took Yashodhara's hand. And now tell me, Dahare, are there any problems in the marital bed? Any questions you want to ask me on how to please your husband? Tell me also how your nights have been this past week. Yashodhara blushed, but then seeing the placid professional interest of the Ganika, she narrated the events of their wedding night and her relations with Siddhartha since. Vimala was genuinely happy, and when she was done, declared with the satisfaction of work well accomplished, "Ah, then my Ganika Kusuma trained your husband well. She will be pleased to hear that." She let out a merry laugh as Yashodhara blushed, embarrassed and shy and also jealous. Vimala took her by the chin again. So very charming. Now, cries of "Amme, Amme" made them turn, and Yashodhara saw a girl running towards a charpoy, her heavy nurse lumbering after her. The girl was holding out a garland of violet flowers, and when she reached the charpoy, she cried, "Amme, see what I made you." Then noticing Yashodhara, she pressed shyly against Vimala. The Ganika lifted the child onto her lap and kissed her all over, crying, "Ah, jewel of my eye." She turned to Yashodhara, "Isn't my Visakha lovely?" Her parents, Brahmin farmers, died in a plague last year that destroyed their village. Poor thing, left orphaned at 3. So I've adopted her, the true love of my life. Sensing Yashodhara's unasked question, she added, "Her future is assured, Dahare. When she is 13, I will secure a great position for her." She nodded to confirm that Yashodhara had understood what she meant by position, then laughed merrily at her guest's barely concealed dismay. But this is who we are, Dahare.
Can I just say it's not easy to read from my book after I...
Stop, you're going. It's wonderful. Your book's wonderful.
I'm a scholar by trade. I'm just putting that out there.
She's much more than that.
So I'm going to read from, I have to do this. I'm going to read from the prologue. The way I start the book is with a scene that happens near the end of the book. Not only does Yashodhara get left by her husband, but he actually leaves her the day she gives birth to their son, according to the Pali tradition. So she gives birth, he sees the child, he goes, and he leaves. Not really, but you know. So he leaves, he goes, he becomes the Buddha, then he comes back. We don't know how many years later, there's different traditions, but let's say 7, 8 years later, he comes back to the palace once he's the Buddha. And then he does his next great move, and this is part of Yashodhara's suffering, is that he looks at his son and he says, I will give you your inheritance, and the inheritance is not to become the king, but it's to receive the teachings. And so he takes his son from Yashodhara and brings him to the forest. And so now she loses her son too. This is the tragedy of Yashodhara. So this is her having to say goodbye to her son. So she's been preparing herself in her room. I walked carefully down the rounded marble staircase that led to the great hall. The trembling had subsided, but I was still a bit uncertain. I held the golden handrail with one hand and I lifted my robes with the other. When I reached the bottom, I exhaled. I could see bodies milling about in the courtyard, men dressed in orange rags moving about silently, ochre-colored shadows. I adjusted my braid one more time, smoothed out my white wrap, and I tightened my sash. And then I crossed the hall to the courtyard with one objective in mind, to find my son. He was sitting by himself by the edge of the lotus pool. How are you, darling? I asked. He didn't look up. His fingers were trailing through the water in between the flowers. A flock of blackbirds tore through the dark sky, chasing the moon like lost souls. He did not notice them either. The servants would start lighting the oil lamp soon, and then everything would be different. Sweetheart? Rahula, I whispered. Please look at me. He trailed his fingers a little longer, making pathways through the water. A frog watched him from the safety of a lotus leaf. Eventually, he looked up. His beautiful eyes were filled with the emotions he could not say. I wanted to fall into them. My mind fled into the past without permission as images of him from over the years paraded before my eyes. When had he grown so tall? I placed a lock of hair behind his ear, as I'd done so many times before. But a moment later, I recoiled at the realization that soon his hair would be shaved away. He would be so different. He wouldn't be my son anymore. How are you feeling, sweetheart? I asked, as I attempted to put the thoughts aside. He shrugged. I'm all right. Are you ready? I guess so. Sweetheart, it's all right to be a bit scared. You don't have to be so brave. He looked up at me. You know, I said, I'm scared too. At these words, all of his restraint melted and he threw himself into my arms. Oh, mother, I'm so scared, I don't want to go. He sobbed against my neck. He was trembling just as I had been a moment earlier. Every fiber in my being wanted to scoop him up and run away, run from the men in orange robes who were forcing us into this separation, run from the world that dictated such realities and said they were wisdom. My baby was crying and all I wanted was to make his tears go away. I inhaled the sweet smell of him. I would have renounced the whole world to be able to hold on to him longer, but I would not renounce his future. Slowly, ever so carefully, I pulled us apart. My most beautiful sweetheart, I whispered, I'm so sad. I can't imagine living without you. I wiped away the tears that were dripping down my own cheeks, but I won't hold you back. It's time for you to go. But I want to be with you, he exclaimed. I know, I want that too. But you'll be with your father. He'll take good care of you. My son looked past me to where the men were, his father sitting straight and elegant at the center. I don't even know him, he objected. You will learn to know him. Well, what if he doesn't like me? That, my darling, is one thing I know you don't have to worry about, I said with a confident smile. You are impossible not to love, my beautiful Rahula. And your father's a good man, you'll see. He wiped his tears, which I knew was a good sign. But what if I never see you again, mother? He asked. I believe we will see each other again, darling. But if anything happens, I stumbled against the words, but then I caught myself. Well, then I'll see you in the next life. We'll never be lost to each other, Rahula. Don't ever forget that. Men in orange robes approached. Are you ready, young master? Asked one of them. Rahula looked into my face, looking for permission. He is ready, I answered.